Gold. Throughout history, cultures around the world have valued this most precious of metals. The fact that gold is relatively scarce only added to its value and made it the object of greed and lust. At the close of the last century, the lust for gold brought the first white men to search this place on the Pacific coast, where the Bear River empties into the Portland Canal, which marks the boundary between Canada and the Alaska Panhandle. For the next 4 decades, this small, rugged, isolated parcel of land was center stage for a parade of characters, from prospectors and pioneers to dreamers and hustlers, policemen and prostitutes. Their stories of struggle and heartbreak, of triumph and sometimes death, defined the history of a unique mining town of Stewart, BC, and of people driven by the desire for wealth beyond their wildest imaginations, who would lose it all in the search for a mountain of gold. The story of this gold rush starts, like so many others, with a rumor. On July 18, 1897, the steamship Portland had docked in Seattle, carrying 68 miners, a rumored ton of gold, and news of a fabulous strike the previous summer in the Yukon. And over the following year, the great Klondike Gold Rush saw 100,000 dreamers attempt the almost unbelievable trek to the Yukon. By the summer of 1898, the Klondike Rush was essentially over, with the good claims having all been staked. But the gold fever still burned as hot as ever. And in Seattle, a scam artist named Burgess proved more than willing to take advantage of the situation.
He was a con man, and he chartered a steamer, and he sold 40 bunks to would-be prospectors and some professional prospectors to come to the head of the Portland Canal because he knew an easy way into the Yukon. And they arrived in the harbor and unloaded, and the next morning the Burgess was gone, and there was a canoe missing. He had collected the money and headed south again. The thing I like to say is Stewart was started on a swindle, and that wasn't the last one by any means.
Labeled the Bunko Expedition, its members were not the only prospectors in the region that summer. There were would-be Klondikers who had been turned back by the almost impossible trek into the Yukon. Others had followed their own rumors of placer gold on the Bear River. George Sapp was one of a party of 8 men who bought a schooner and sailed to the Portland Canal in 1898. In dozens of letters to his wife back in the States, Sapp provides rare glimpses into the life of a greenhorn in the mountain wilderness. He also reveals how once a man has gold fever, there is little can be done to cure it.
July 15th. Dear May, since we came, a steamer landed 70 prospectors with dogs and horses at the head of the canal. It only took a few days for some of them to become discouraged, as they soon learned that gold does not grow on bushes. The Indians are making a harvest getting them out of here in canoes or any old way. Some of them intend to stay.
Among those who stayed was a real prospector, DJ Dad Rainey. For Rainey, this would become home. He would be the first white man to build a permanent cabin in the district. The contrast between men like Rainey and those like Sapp was remarkable. Both were after gold, but the greenhorns seemed to have no idea how or where to find it. Men like Sapp spent more time climbing and walking than prospecting.
Oh, they were looking for gold. They'd been inspired by stories from the Klondike. They found some gold, but they didn't find enough to make a mining prospect, and they had to go back. They ran out of food, and some of them said they probably would have found a good prospect if they'd had more food.
They are looking for placer gold, the fine gold dust and nuggets which have washed out of the rock and settled at the bottom of stream beds.
And they were looking at the gravel bars in the rivers, because the gold probably starts up in the mountains, but it gradually, because of its weight, creeps down the mountains and becomes mixed in with the rest of the gravel that's being churned up in the rivers, and it's easier to find. You need a shovel, you need a pan. If there's gold there, you can wash it out. You don't have to go chop it out of the rock.
Because placer mining is fairly easy. It's a matter of finding it on the ground, or at least sifting it out of the dirt. It's the easiest way to find gold, and if you've got gold in your eyes to look for it, like, that's the way you want to find it. That would have been a disappointment to people who first came here, because there isn't a lot of fertile ground for placer.
Sapp's letters document one wild goose chase after another as he and his companions spend the summer and fall on forced marches through the bush, chasing each new rumor of the big strike just around the next bend in the river.
July 6th. It's about a 50-mile trip to a new and untried part. We expect to cross a big glacier on the divide. I am getting so I can make from 10 to 20 miles a day. July 15th. Salmon River. I'm a little sore from the forced march of yesterday, but we'll be all right in a day or two. Saw enough to warrant us in going in again. July 20th. Clear, warm. Made only 4 miles on Bear River Flats, some dangerous wading. Wet all day long. Howell and Mather become discouraged and frightened and turn back. Friday the 22nd. Rained all day. Traveled 8 miles over a slippery mountain trail, past a camp of prospectors. Some will go with us. Camp near Bear River. Wet.
These guys were miners, they were prospectors, and they were accustomed to disappointment, and they had a technique which was pan every creek you come to, and if there's not in that, go the next one. And if there's not in that, climb in a canoe, go up the river, or walk over the mountain, go the next valley. And it's a technique that works. You just keep, these guys kept walking and panning and testing for weeks, months sometimes. And they'd go anywhere. And they'd climb a mountain. They were all over the mountains. They were finding mines 4,000 or 5,000 feet up a mountain just underneath the glacier. And they probably could only live decently for 2 months of the year up there if they were lucky. But they did that.
On several occasions, Sapp thought he'd found what he's looking for. But, as always, the valleys were too steep and the water ran too fast. And each day became longer and more of a struggle.
July 15th. We found good ground, but I cannot figure out how we can possibly work it in the short season they have here. Could do nothing with it, owing to the daily floods from the glaciers. When the sun shines all day, the waters come down all night with great force and violence. August the 31st. My dear May, what I have been expecting to happen has happened. The last of our party, except one, have decided to leave the country and get back to the civilized world as soon as possible. I showed the boys my find to try to induce them to stop a while, but when a man gets homesick or stampedes, you can't stop him. They are cured and will now be satisfied with enough to eat and wear. It is surprising, but I haven't forgot what I came for. I can see no good reason for leaving so hurriedly.
Sapp becomes more desperate and more determined to keep going when it is clear success is impossible. He is not yet cured of gold fever. Hooking up with a few others still tramping the district, his trips become longer, yet no more successful. As fall sets in, Sapp begins finally to realize his days in the district are numbered. His last letter home reveals that his thirst for gold survives, but he will look elsewhere to quench it.
Dear May, probably sometime in January we will sail across to Mary's Island and there take a steamer to Skagway or Juneau. We may go into the Yukon next spring. We have heard something of the Lake and Atland country. It may be newspaper talk, but the boys wanted to send me up to investigate.
Written in November 1898, it is the last of Sapp's letters to survive. What happened to him after that winter is not known. But he would not reappear in the Stewart region. While Sapp had headed for the coast and out of the district, Dad Rainey decided to stay the winter, settling near what would eventually become the Stewart townsite. After 3 years on his own, Rainey was joined in 1902 by William Noble and Pop Stewart. Together they built a base camp and cut trails to the sites Rainey had staked in 1899 and set up a small placer operation. In the summer of 1902, the three partners did ship the first gold ore from the region. It was not the mountain of gold that would later be advertised to the outside world, but that shipment would spark further interest and attract new prospectors to the area. The raging fever was about to return. And Dad Rainey saw a town in the future for the little camp at the mouth of the Bear River. In the summer of 1902, he began staking land for a town site. As it turned out, he had not begun to lay claim to the town site any too soon, because among the first to take note of the mineral finds along the Bear River were the Stewarts, 4 Scottish brothers on their way back to Victoria in 1902. Rainey continued to live and prospect in the Bear River district for another 14 years. Besides being recognized as one of the town's pioneers, Rainey also gained a reputation for his coolness in the face of danger. On one occasion, Rainey was herding a pack train near the Bear River when the horses slipped and were swept in. He was almost dragged in as well, but somehow managed to save all of the horses and himself. When someone commented that it had been a close call, Rainey's reply was typically understated.
Yes, darn it, I got my feet all wet.
But in the end, after many close calls, the Bear River got the best of Rainey. On March 9th, 1917, he fell to his death from a cliff on the west side of the river. In the end, all of the early prospectors seemed to leave, some on their own steam, cursing the fever which had consumed them, others left in a simple pine box. It would be the Stuart brothers, John and Robert, who gave the town its name and stayed on to set the stage for the boom that was to come, when the world would come looking for a mountain of gold. In 1902, after 4 years in the district, the early prospectors and miners were scratching only a meager living from their claims. Things began to change, however, with the arrival that September of a 38-year-old Scottish immigrant. John Stewart was the middle child among 11 born to a former teacher turned merchant and his wife at Leith, Scotland. The 6 Stuart brothers had emigrated to Canada in 1890, and 2 years later, when their father's health began to fail, convinced their parents and sisters to join them at Saanich on Vancouver Island.
The Stewart boys were very interesting. They were all characters on their own. Some were thinkers, some were doers. They were very much arguers. My mother tells stories of them all sitting around the table, yelling at one another, slamming their fists on the table, arguing, shouting. And then finally, they said, well, we've had enough of that, let's have some tea.
In 1900, leaving others to tend the family's pioneer fruit farm, John, James, William, and Robert Stewart followed rumors of a gold strike in the northern BC interior.
All the boys were travelers and adventurers. And the first one to go up there was John. And he went up in the Atlan district and was quite successful panning gold. And he met a geologist up there who gave him some pretty good reports of mineral deposits in the Stewart area.
A brief visit in the fall convinced John Stewart to return in the spring of 1903. He built a cabin and did some prospecting, but soon realized that the real money would be made not staking claims, but staking out a town site. By the end of the summer, he bought out Dad Rainey's share, and when the whole tidal flat was declared to be within Canada, he took a gamble and rushed south to register his claim in Victoria. In 1904, John Stewart returned with his brother Robert. Prospecting had picked up, and the first small mining efforts were underway.
John was the thinker, Robert was the doer in the family, and John could see the prospects ahead, but you have to come up with money, so they went ahead and they came up with 2 companies, and they, by selling lots in the town area to people, that money went in to develop the mine, and they, of course, had the first large flourishing mine in the area.
The Stewarts participated in many of these early operations, but it was already obvious to the canny Scots that there was more profit in promoting a boom and building a town site to service its needs than in actual prospecting. In 1905, that tiny town site was named Stewart, after the younger of the 2 brothers.
Robert, and the reason is he was the first postmaster. In that era, that was often the procedure that the Canadian government followed. They, They named it after the first postmaster, and that's what happened here.
In March 1906, the brothers incorporated the Stewart Land Company. They cleared lots, laid out streets, which exist to this day, and put up the town's first buildings. The building of a city in the middle of nowhere had begun. One of the earliest was an office for J.D. Conway, the first deputy mining recorder, a job Robert Stewart would later take over. In 1906, they also erected a building which served as store, post office, and the town's first hotel. About this time, the Stewarts also created the Stewart Mining and Development Company Limited, and, besides building lots, began dealing in mining ventures. The brothers worked several possible mine sites themselves, with partners like early prospector Ward Brightwell, seen here with Robert Stewart. The stage was set for a first big mining rush, but a lack of investment limited activity primarily to small hand mining operations. That all changed in 1908. The Red Cliff Mine was a project of railroad magnate Donald Mann. Mann had the money to put dozens of men to work developing a mine site. One member of an early crew at the Red Cliff camp was none other than John Stewart. That same year, the Victoria-based Portland Canal Mining Company acquired a dozen claim sites that had been staked 2 years earlier along Glacier Creek, just 4 miles north of Stewart. When results from early tunnels showed significant amounts of gold, as well as silver and lead, the company was able to promote its find and raise additional foreign and local capital. Much needed money to build a concentrating mill and erect an aerial tram line from the mine site to the mill. In 1909, Stewart was still not much more than a tent town of a few hundred residents, with only a handful of cabins, but its first and biggest boom had been set in motion.
Initially, there would be very few, just those that were already there. But then as soon as the mines opened up, you had people coming in, applying for work. And then, of course, the town being advertised in the Daily Colonist in Victoria, there were many, many people going up there with the hopes of buying land.
I think the time was just ripe. There was a lot of stock promotion in this, and when I look at those values in 1910, they're big values even today. If that was anything like that, then you could see, and I've seen pictures between 1909 and 1910, the town just emerged instantly.
Well, a boom town, of course, we all know, has everything from hotels to entertainment. Some of the entertainment was above board and some was below, and it had both. You had the saloons, you had houses of entertainment for gentlemen, as they might have been called, and it would be the live theater and so on.
In the midst of all this activity, the lust for wealth had blinded many to the fact that there was still virtually no mineral ore being shipped from Stewart.
It's no different than the stock market. When it comes to that kind of speculation, there's winners and losers, and for this whole town to emerge out of a stock in mineral play, there was some winners.
Among the winners were the Stuart Brothers. None of their mining ventures had come into play yet, but in 1910, they were doing very well indeed. From their little building on 5th Street, they not only sold building lots, but operated 3 different mining companies and the Stewart Portland Canal Power, Light and Water Company. By February, 15,000 $1 shares with which they had started the Stewart Land Company were now worth $10 a share. In May of 1910, the Stewart Stock Exchange opened in the lobby of the King Edward Hotel. Here, a lot of money changed hands. The global economy was booming, and people had money to invest in towns like Stewart. And the town's new newspaper regularly fueled the speculation by reporting each new mineral discovery as high grade. Then, in June, the editor apparently decided to give things an extra boost.
In 1910, Jimmy Cullen, he was the editor of the Portland Canal Miner, and he admitted things were very slow. He didn't have very much to report, so he decided to start a gold rush at the head of Bitter Creek. And he wrote an article about reports coming out of a mountain of gold at the head of Bitter Creek. And of course, newspapers around the world would copy what the other one had written, and it went right to London, and a big rush ensued out here on straight malarkey.
Shiploads of new prospectors came looking for Cullen's mountain of gold. By summer's end, they had staked every acre of the Bear Valley and were spilling over into the adjacent Salmon and Marmot valleys.
I don't think they would have come for their livelihood. They would have come to, hopefully, make it rich somehow.
The town was filling up as well, as businesses set up to serve all the needs of a town with a population approaching 10,000, with 3 hotels, numerous rooming houses, 2 banks, many stores, several cafes, pool rooms, and barbershops. Stewart was no longer just a mining camp. Women and children now made up almost a quarter of the population. And, with a Stuart brother on every board, the town was well organized into committees and organizations to plan and find money for all manner of public projects. What they couldn't finance locally, they pressured the provincial government to build. Soon, Stewart also boasted a modern school, a fully equipped fire hall, a courthouse, and a public hospital. The provincial government was also spending money in the district, building roads, bridges, and trails to the mine sites in the surrounding valleys, and causeways to the Deepwater Wharf. All of this building was taking place on the acreage first staked by Dad Rainey and John Stewart back in 1903. There was an incredible pressure on land prices. In the summer of 1910, a single 25 by 100-foot lot was sold at auction for a reported $10,000. John Stewart had traded his prospector's outfit for a business suit. He and Robert had created a town out of nothing. A mining boom town, where the only mountain of gold was still just a newspaper editor's fantasy. It would be another man's fantasy, of a railroad through the mountains to the prairies that would take center stage and see the town go from boom to ruin. Jimmy Cullen's tall tale of a mountain of gold may have been the spark that lit Stewart's mining boom. But the fuel for the flames was the arrival on the Stewart scene of 2 self-made millionaires. One, a burly Canadian railroader, the other, an elegant German aristocrat. In 1909, Donald Mann was already a Canadian railroad building legend and co-owner of the vast Canadian Northern Railway empire. His dream to make Stewart the Pacific port at the end of the Transcontinental Railroad would survive for a quarter of a century. Constantine Alvo von Alvensleben was reputed to be BC's first millionaire, worth an estimated $25 million. At age 30, he was certainly the youngest. His luxury hotel was an attempt to put the frontier mining town on the world map. If these two self-made millionaires were convinced that there was money to be made in Stewart, that was all the proof most people needed.
I think that's what gave this town its real start, put it on the map.
Donald Mann first became involved with Stewart as owner of the Red Cliff Mining Company. But building railroads, not mining, was his real trade. Over the previous 3 decades, Mann earned the reputation as the young nation's greatest railroad builder and a giant of industry, able to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to support his sometimes outrageous schemes. A rumored upcoming visit to Stewart was always good for the front page.
Donald D. Mann, Canada's financial and industrial king, is expected soon to visit the Portland Canal District, and it is assured that the people will accord him a king's welcome, for perhaps no other man has given the camp such impetus and brought it so prominently before the eyes of the financial world.
Not bad for someone born and raised in the backwoods of southern Ontario, far from any railroad lines. The big, strong farm kid, first a divinity student, then a blacksmith and a lumber worker, soon found his true calling in railway construction. In 1888, Mann had teamed up with William Mackenzie, another Presbyterian Scot and small-town Ontario boy who also got his start with the CPR. Backed by Mackenzie's genius for raising money, Mann showed a flair for laying track where it could carry the most freight and quickly repay its costs.
Mackenzie and Mann were both entrepreneurs in the truest sense of the word. They simply were a pair of individuals who could visualize a good thing and the possibility of perhaps making some money out of it, but turning around and investing it further in to enhance their dreams and aspirations.
The promoters of railways were like our latter-day mining promoters. They didn't care whether the end result worked or not, as long as they could raise the money and spend it and get their 10 or 20%. They really cared less, and I think in that era, 1900 to 1914, there were railways started all over Canada and that went from nowhere to nowhere. It was the thing to invest money in.
So when a group of Seattle investors obtained a charter in 1909 to build a rail line to mine sites near Stewart, Mann took an interest. A dozen miles of narrow-gauge track is okay if you're thinking small, but Donald Mann had a bigger dream.
He could visualize the potential of the land and wanted to be part of it. And both he and his partner really shared in that vision.
A result of that was when Mackenzie and Mann built the Portland Canal Short Line Railway, which serviced 2 of the mines, the Portland Canal and the Red Cliff, which was 15 miles up the valley. But it was a standard gauge railway, and they had just come off building the transcontinental to Prince Rupert. So they were hopeful of getting government funds to build all the way to the Peace River.
Mann's scheme was to make Stewart not just a mining town, but a major Pacific port at the end of Canada's second transcontinental railroad. The idea was to link up with Mann's Canadian Northern Railway, which already reached from Edmonton to Montreal. Only someone with Mann's history and reputation could give credibility to such a bold, almost outrageous scheme. It was, after all, no more than he and Mackenzie had already accomplished.
It was realistic. It was realistic in terms of physically making that connection if there were supporting economics required. But bear in mind, in building the Portland Canal Railway, it would be completely dependent on the traffic that might originate at the mine.
While he was building the rail line, Donald Mann also became partners with the young German nobleman Alvo von Alvensleben. In Stewart, the Count was best remembered as the original owner of what is still the town's largest building.
He had this notion that if you're going to build it big and build it right downtown. And you can see that with the Empress Hotel, you know, a 70-room hotel in this town. He had a lot of hope.
It has 70 rooms for guests, everyone appointed in strictly good taste. Oak furniture, iron and brass beds with comfortable mattresses. A comfortably furnished present 3 tables. Throughout, the house is fitted with electric light and a modern annunciator system connecting each room. Baths and toilets with hot and cold water.
It would have been an awesome building at the time. The Empress was a true hotel.
The tall, aristocratic von Alvensleben looked the image of his nickname, the Count. He was, in fact, the son of a baroness and a German count who had been the ambassador to Russia. But, as a third son, Alvo had little hope of inheriting his father's title. In 1904, lured by rumors of Alaskan gold, Alvo arrived at Vancouver. Broke, and learning the gold rush had died out, he joined the local salmon fleet. The timing was perfect. The southern BC waters had their biggest salmon runs in decades. Alvo bought his own boat, and in 3 years had saved a $1,500 stake. With the cash, he bought one of the first seats on the new Vancouver Stock Exchange. Within a few years, he was worth an estimated $25 million. For the Count, Donald Mann's dream of a rail line from Stewart to Edmonton promised access to northern BC coalfields vital to his investors in pre-war Germany. Meanwhile, in Stewart, construction was booming on both sides of the tracks. The population of the town and surrounding district was up to about 10,000 people. Businesses were expanding and new ones were rumored. The telegraph line reached town. A salmon cannery and box factory were announced. The Stuart Brothers Power Company promised to begin telephone service and to upgrade the electric plant with a new water wheel. When residents ushered in 1911 with the Grand New Year's Day ball at the Empress Hotel, Stewart was at the peak of its boom. 1911 marked the height of Donald Mann's Stewart adventure. He and Mackenzie were knighted, and in June he opened his new Canadian Northeastern. With 2 locomotives, 25 freight cars, and 1 passenger coach, the Canadian Northeastern ran a daily train between the town and the Red Cliff Mine. Newspaper editor Jim Cullen, always open to a new rumor, eagerly published tales of rich new mineral finds and reports that the Red Cliff would soon be shipping 100 tons of ore a day. The once tiny frontier mining camp was now a booming mining port. For Stewart and for the prospectors, speculators, and industrialists who had helped it grow, the tall tale of a mountain of gold was becoming a reality. They could barely wait to see what 1912 would bring. As it turned out, the summer of 1911 was the highlight of Stewart's big boom. That fall, political troubles and a faltering economy in Europe triggered a global depression that would end only with a world war. mineral prices plummeted, making the low-grade ore from Stewart's mines almost worthless. By early 1912, both the Portland Canal and the Red Cliff mines were closed for good.
I'm sure the total tonnage it hauled was not over 10,000 tons. Today's coal trains coming from Alberta to Roberts Bank haul more in one load than that railway did in a couple of years.
With no new investors and no ore to carry, and facing a $14 million cost overrun, Mann's Railway also closed. The exodus was on. After less than 2 years in business, the Grand Empress Hotel closed its doors. For Stewart, the declaration of war in 1914 was the killing blow.
So many people went and joined up for the war. And I think by 1917 there were 70 people in the district.
Home to 10,000 just 5 years earlier, Stewart was a virtual ghost town. But if the town's pulse was weak, it was not dead. Neither was the gold fever that got it started. In the surrounding mountains, a few dozen determined prospectors continued to work their claims. And a few newcomers continued to struggle in from the south, drawn by a fever for gold that even a depression and a war could not extinguish. Among them were the Workmans, Ernest, Laura, and their 3 children from Seattle and Victoria. Roy Workman, then just 5, vividly recalled his days in Stewart in a biography written almost 70 years later.
My father was always looking to make it big. He had sold the house in Victoria and had a little cash, so he bought a mine in Stewart for $500, which was a lot of money in 1916. Surprise, the mine was a pile of rock that someone had staked out, and it was worthless.
At least housing was no problem for the Workmans. With only a few dozen residents, the former town of 10,000 was full of abandoned buildings. The Workmans rented a former doctor's home with an abandoned drugstore on the main floor. But even in 1916 Stewart, the utilities were primitive. The Workman's landlord, Ben Lawrence, a former American farm boy, was a survivor of the 1910 boom. Too old for the Army and with nothing to draw him back to the States, in 1916 Lawrence was a part-time prospector who maintained claim sites for a mining company. His new tenant also proved to be a survivor. When Ernest Workman's $500 mine proved to be a dud, he didn't bemoan his fate or head back south.
My father began building a boat, but always on the lookout for the big chance, he never finished it. While whipsawing the boards for the boat and thinking about all the boards and timber being shipped to Stewart for the mines, he got the idea to build a water-powered sawmill. He sold all the materials for the boat and concentrated on the sawmill. Ben liked the idea too. They formed a partnership and pooled resources. My father also talked Ben into moving into one of our bedrooms. We had plenty.
The Workman Lawrence Mill was underway. Even with only maintenance work at district mines, timbers were in great demand. And in the mountains, just 13 miles north of town, the search continued for Stewart's mountain of gold. Pat Daly was one of the survivors of the 1910 boom. For 8 long years, the big, affable Irishman would struggle, often on his own, to prove an old claim site on the west slope of the Bear River Ridge. Occasionally, big U.S. mining companies optioned the property and spent tens of thousands in unsuccessful attempts to prove the mine.
They'd run out of money and hadn't hit the ore, and then the next one came along, and that was R.K. Neal and Wood, Trites, and Wilson from Fernie. And within 2 rounds, they were into the Bonanza ore.
The Fernie Syndicate had uncovered the fabulous Premier Mine, and by the end of 1919, they sold half their $100,000 mine for $1 million. The mountain of gold had been found. The bust of 1913 seemed forgotten. And as if the Premier radiated some magic, prospectors began making spectacular strikes at other old claim sites, like the Silverado, 4,000 feet up Mount Rainey, overlooking the town. And the district's richest mine, the Big Missouri, just 5 miles north of the Premier. Soon there was work for everyone. Roads were pushed through to mine sites, and hundreds of men were employed to build tram lines through the mountains. All this construction demanded a lot of timber, and the struggling workman in Lawrence sawmill was soon running full out every summer. This became a source of tension between young Roy Workman's parents.
My father didn't like Mother trying to run the business. She did not agree with his decisions. They agreed he would take $100 cash and leave his assets to her. On November 8th, he walked the telegraph line to Antioch, BC, and eventually Chicago. The following May, my mother and sisters moved to Bremerton, Washington. I was 14. I was brokenhearted.
There may have been more to the family breakup than young Roy recognized. Among remaining photos of the Workman family, the father, Ernest, appears in only one. Always present, however, was Ben Lawrence.
Ben managed the company. I worked at the power plant 7 days a week until Christmas 1926. Then I visited my mother, and she insisted I not go back. A short while after, Ben came also and proposed to my mother. They were married on June 14th, 1927.
The Workmans would never return to Stewart, except for brief visits. In Stewart, however, it was the middle of the roaring 20s, and the mining boom continued. Home to more than 1,500, mostly single men, the town sometimes needed a tough cop to keep the peace. In 1926, the BC Provincial Police assigned a policeman who would prove nothing if not tough. When the SS Prince Rupert docked at the Stewart Wharf on June the 4th, 1926, one of her passengers was Lance Potterton, a constable with the newly formed BC police force. For the next 10 years, he would be the only cop for Stewart and for 2,000 square miles of surrounding wilderness. What he found was a bustling frontier mining port, home to 3,000 people, 3/4 of them young men.
The town was booming and wide open. Everyone was filthy rich, and money was flowing like water. There were 3 licensed hotels on Main Street, and as soon as they opened, they filled up as fast as a church rummage sale. The only thing different was the language being used. They were a noisy crowd, all shouting for beer at the same time. I went into Anderson's Cafe for lunch. A sign over the door read, "The best cook this far north." After I had eaten, I thought perhaps it was the cook's day off.
In the afternoon, Potterton located the building that was to be both his office and his home. His wife and 2 young daughters were to arrive in just 2 weeks.
I think it was a shock when they saw the building. There were 4 big bare walls, no bathroom, no hot water. And he did have a hot water tank and a bathtub put in. No cupboards in the kitchen. It was pretty rugged.
Between building cupboards and installing a water heater, Lance Potterton spent his first few weeks exploring the town without his uniform.
I found it much easier in civilian clothes until I became acquainted with the people of the area. I watched the poker games played during the nights at the hotel lobbies and in Caribou Pete's smoke shop. Games started at 6 in the evening and went until 6 in the morning. I knew of men who lost or won as much as $5,000 at one sitting.
2 miles west in Hyder, Alaska, 1926 was the middle of the U.S. Prohibition era, making Stewart home base for thousands of miners on both sides of the border who regularly hit the town with money, burning holes in their pockets. Dealing with drunken miners became a large part of Potterton's job.
They were basically good-hearted, I think, and they only seemed to get out of line when they were drinking. They would be out at the mines for weeks or maybe even months, so they wanted to have a little fun when they came down. So the only thing they knew was to go and start drinking, and always overdid it. But most of them weren't too much trouble. There were 1 or 2, especially one.
Especially Big Jock Morrison, who had been pointed out to Potterton as the toughest man in town and a mean drunk.
He was a big man, even bigger than my dad, I think. And he really got out of hand, and he wanted to be boss, so I guess he had been for quite a while, but my dad had to really show him who was boss.
He said, "You're the bloody cop," then stood on the veranda and began to urinate onto the street. I spun him around, pushed him into the hotel while the water was still pouring out of him. Now this must have made him mad. He came rolling out shouting, "No son of a bitch can do that to me," and came at me with his fist swinging. I took 1 hard blow to the shoulder, then gave him a hard punch in the stomach, which was full of beer. Chopped him under the ear, and he dropped to the veranda.
Potterton eventually bundled Big Jock into a taxi and over to the jail, where he tried to tear apart the cells before passing out.
He always preferred to settle confrontations as peaceably as he could. He preferred to take a drunken man home and put him in his own bed, the drunken man's own bed, rather than lock him up. He was always willing to do things like that for people rather than treat them in a confrontational way.
I don't think you would have survived otherwise. I think if you came with a big city attitude into a small town and applying the rules of the law in such a firm manner, you would not get any support whatsoever. And the more support we get, the better the police force is. And he obviously had the personality and the attitude that fit well into that environment.
Other than the odd drunken miner blowing off steam, Potterton found little excitement in his day-to-day duties in the town.
most of the crises would be for him when trappers died on the trap line and accidents occurred out in the bush, fires and grizzly bear attacks and that sort of thing. And although they were few and far between, they were certainly, to him and to others, memorable, because you have hundreds of hours of utter boredom and then moments of sheer terror.
Some of those moments found Potterton scaling mountains and glaciers in the search for missing miners, with only inches separating him from a 3,000-foot drop. Once, during a January blizzard, he and 4 other members of a search party found themselves speeding down the face of the glacier on a toboggan, blasting through snowdrifts and dodging huge crevices. More than enough excitement to make up for any boredom back in town. But if there was anything in town that definitely wasn't boring, it was the red light district, an area called the Line.
The Line was a row of houses where prostitutes were kept. And of course, at first we didn't know too much about that, and we didn't go down there, but we gradually started hearing things.
In the late 1920s, town cop Lance Potterton reported that the houses on the Line were tidy and neatly painted. They were illegal, but he treated their operation as a necessary evil.
With several thousand men, either single or if married, living away from home, there had to be a safety valve. For obvious reasons, the red light district was tolerated and supervised.
Oh, certainly, because there were hundreds of men in the bunkhouse. There were no unmarried women in the country, and they were tolerated by everyone.
But they were not welcomed into the society of the town. They usually came downtown only on Tuesdays to shop and to visit the doctor. And when they left the houses on the Line, they had to call the police office, where Potterton's daughter, Joan, sometimes took calls when he was out of town.
If they left the houses, they had to let my dad know where they were. So they would phone, and they didn't have to ask permission. They just had to let him know where they were. And they would say, I'm going to, if this is Molly, I'm going to Zephyr's or somewhere. And I'd say, okay. And then I would write down on his blotter, Molly has gone uptown to the bank or wherever. But I have to laugh now thinking of the 12 years old and I'm almost giving permission to these prostitutes to go somewhere.
There was also a grudging respect for the women who worked the houses. Most were Americans, from West Coast cities from California to Alaska. Many of them well-educated young women, lured north by the prospect of easy money. Some were refugees from bad marriages, who had left their children behind with others, while they worked to put together a stake that would let them survive in a world with few jobs for single mothers.
They classed themselves as working girls. There was no work in the hungry 30s, so that was a job, and that's what they called themselves, working girls.
But if there is one thing they could count on, it was the watchful eye of Constable Potterton. He was always around to step in if things got a little rough.
Because, when a miner had been in camp for months and then got some drink in him, he would get frisky and maybe try to push the girls around or things like that. And Potterton especially, he didn't allow pimps, so it sort of made a bit more work for him. If somebody got a little out of line down there, they'd have to phone him and he'd come down and straighten them out pretty quick.
But there is no mention of the roadhouses or the red light district in the Stuart Brothers' latest pamphlet promoting the town. In the late 1920s, the town continued to boom. The premier was still pumping out ore. New mines were developed at the Dunhill, United Empire, and Big Missouri sites. In all, more than 24 smaller mines were operating, and more than 400 new claims were filed in a single year. However, members of the local Citizens Association realized how fragile a boom based just on mining can be. Headed by the Stewarts, they pushed for the revival of Donald Mann's railroad dream and began raising funding. In 1929, the Consolidated Mining Company picked up the dormant franchise and announced plans to extend the old rail line to the east. But it was not to be. The great stock market crash of October 1929 was just around the corner. And, like the rest of the world, Stewart would not escape its consequences. By the late 20s, all the fantasies of Stewart's early hustlers and schemers appeared to have been realized. The premier mine, it seemed, had tapped a real mountain of gold. The town's population is more than 2,500. Another 600 lived at the premier site. Everyone, it seemed, was making money. Then came Black Thursday, October the 24th, 1929. And all dreams of stock market bonanzas disappeared.
Well, once the crash hit, people, of course, left Stewart in droves. The mines eventually could not be kept going. The money wasn't there. And so it was vastly becoming a ghost town.
As mines closed and government road crews were laid off, hundreds of unemployed workers were warehoused at government relief camps in the mountains 10 miles from town. Each year, more businesses went broke. Even the Stewart family was not immune to the Depression.
It was rather like when the Titanic was going down. You did everything possible to convince yourself that it will not sink. Eventually, they came to the realization that it was gone, and money had been borrowed that could never be paid back.
For the second time in a generation, Stewart's dreams were dashed on the rocks of a world depression and another world war. And as in 1914, the little frontier town staggered, but did not collapse. It would survive through a series of smaller booms and busts, and another world war. And always the prospectors would return. The arrival of the highway in the 50s helped boost tourism. A salmon fishery opened, and over the years, logging became a major industry.
Well, Stewart, of course, was a mining town from day one, and now timber is our mainstay, except for tourism, and tourism is a big attraction for a very limited period of the year. Well, it's a nice little kicker, but you need working men to have a community prosper. So if you don't have miners and loggers, you never have much of a community in this part of the world.
Stewart has survived, but it never became the gateway city to the riches of the BC interior and the continent beyond the mountains. Donald Mann never returned. Once worth more than $25 million, he died in 1934, leaving an estate of less than $100,000. As for the two men who started it all, the Stuart Brothers survived the town's first crash, but never really recovered from from the second.
I suppose they could have turned around and sold and been millionaires and gone into retirement, but that was not the thing to do. And they kept right in there till the end. They saw their dream evolve, and they saw their dream die.
In late 1936, the Pottertons were transferred 250 miles south to Ocean Falls, a town with a still active lumber mill.
My dad was ready to go by then because the town had become so quiet. I don't know how it could have got boring because he always had a lot of work to do, but I guess not enough excitement.
Lance Potterton served 2 more decades at other posts in the province with the BC Police and later the RCMP. On his death in 1992, at age 97, his ashes were scattered over the Salmon Glacier, 5 miles from town, in the wilderness he loved so much.
All that was left in this great and massive hinterland were the ghosts of the trappers, prospectors, Indians, and adventurers who died there.
The history of Stewart, BC is full of ghosts, and with them the echoes of old hopes and dreams. The life of a mining town never truly ends, and the final chapter of the Stewart story remains to be told. Is another boom creeping over the horizon? Many have given up, but a few modern prospectors working among the decaying camps and trails and mines that cling to the mountainsides still believe. There will always remain a fever and a hardy pursuit of a new mountain of gold.